Over the course of building this set, I managed to smash it 3 separate times, which was hours to fix and a lot of frustration. So if you're planning on following this yourself, be warned, you are very likely to break something. I took this piece of ash that I had laying around the shop and chopped it down to size. It's about 13 inches wide and 22 inches long. Really, it could be any kind of piece of wood. Keep in mind though that you want to be able to put some decently thick screws into it, so try to find something that's at least a little bit thick. I'm using a 45-degree router bit to add just a little bit of a chamfer around the edge of this. It's no real purpose, it just makes it look a little bit nicer. I'm using 120 grit sandpaper to sand down the bulk of the material, and then using 220 to make it pretty smooth. This isn't something that anyone's ever going to need to touch or even really look at, hopefully, but if they do, I want it to look kinda nice. So bring in the Falcon and set it down on the wood. You want to try to keep it mostly centered, and ideally you don't want the feet hanging off the edge if possible, because the feet will actually take some of the weight when hanging on the wall. You'll have to take off 2 of the back plates and 1 in the center. Take the brackets and feed them up from underneath. You'll want them pressed up against the main Technic pieces and as far wide as you can go. There are a couple edge pieces that you can push them up against. I got a piece of 1x2 and set it on top of the brackets, then used some clamps to hold it down. That would make it so I can easily pull the Falcon off without having these brackets move. Then come back with a pencil and trace out where the mounting holes are. With those 2 roughly centered, take the 3rd bracket and measure so it's centered. Then, from the back of these brackets to the front of the front one, it's about 4¼ inches. This is a really hard one to line up, so you have to kind of do it just by measure. The front one is actually going to go around 2 pieces of Lego. So get a 2x piece, a 2x plate, put it on the bracket, and mark out where it is. Measure roughly 3¼ inches from the bottom of the bracket up and put a mark there. Then use an angle grinder and a cutting blade to just chop out a little rectangle. Of course, use safety glasses and ear mufflers just to make sure you're safe. You can cut straight down the edges and then score it, and then using pliers you can kind of bend it and break it out. After that, use a grinding disc to clean up the edge so you don't cut yourself or end up damaging the Falcon. On that piece, below the cut, drill another hole that's centered there. You use that hole later with some mounting wire to be able to mount the Falcon securely to the wall to make sure it doesn't come off. I didn't measure the spacing inside the Falcon before I bought these brackets, and unfortunately they were a little bit too wide. I ended up just using the angle grinder and cutting them down each by about 1/2 inch, and that gave me plenty of room. Now back to the router, make 4 1/2-inch slots down the top. Make sure those slots don't go under any of the feet of the Falcon, or that they don't go under where the brackets are. These slots we're going to use to press fit in the LED strips. It makes it so you don't have to trust that crappy 3M tape that never ever sticks, and you won't have to do glue or anything like that. It also makes it so you can just pull them out and replace them later if you ever have to. I found 4 strips work nicely, but if you have different lights or you want more or less light, you can just put in more or less strips. On the back of it, I'm also adding an extra slot. This extra slot is for running the wires behind it so you don't see a lot of the connections. Take out the strips and measure roughly how long you want them to be. I think about 1 inch or 2 away from either end is probably good. Inside the strip, you'll see 2 little copper pads and a little scissor image At that spot, you can just cut them. You can use a knife or scissors, whatever you're comfortable with. Then go through, and with a drill bit, you want to drill out the holes for the mounting brackets. And when you're also drilling out these holes, make sure to drill 4 holes in the top slots through so that they line up with the slot in the back. You'll actually route the wires through these holes, so ideally you want to be able to keep the wires inside that back trough. I'm staining this because I want it to match the other wood that's inside my office. I could actually have used a big hunk of walnut or something like that, but that would be really expensive. This is a piece of wood that I had laying around, so just putting in some dark stain on it gets it close enough. Now back to the LED strips. These strips are waterproof, so they have an extra layer of silicone on them. You don't need this. This is just the strips that I happen to have. Use a knife and kind of chop back that silicone. Make sure not to cut all the way through and cut the circuit on the back. If you cut close, you can usually just bend and crack it off. Once the silicone is cleared up, tin the ends and then tin a set of wires. Ideally, if the wires are braided, that does make it a lot easier to route them through the board. This isn't necessary. It's basically just so you don't have to worry about shorting out wires internally when you put on some heat shrink. Just use a little silicone and put it over the ends to coat the wires and seal the strip back up. Wipe-on poly is my go-to for most sealing things. So use a little bit of poly, make sure to use a glove, and use a soft cloth to wipe it on. Make sure to also do the back. It isn't something you're going to see, but it helps make sure that the wood will expand and contract more evenly with temperature and humidity changes. You probably only need 1 layer, but it just will help preserve it so it doesn't warp. I put on 3 layers of wipe-on poly, and before the last layer, I sanded the whole thing down with 220 grit sandpaper. That just makes it so it's nice and smooth and gives it a really good finish. Once the silicone is dry, you can come with some heat shrink and shrink it onto the ends. Using a lighter like this is definitely not the best way to do it. I recommend using a hot air gun or a proper torch. There's a bunch of different better ways to do it than this, but this is all I had at the time. Feed the wires through from the front to the back. Press the strips into the slots. You shouldn't need glue or anything like that to make them fit nicely. On the back, connect the wires together so that you have power on one side and ground on the other. If you're not great at soldering, using some heat shrink to hold the wires together before you solder them can save you a little bit of time. Once they're soldered together, you can use the terminal block that's included with the power supply to do a really quick test. Once you know it works, remove the terminal block and solder on the power supply wires nicely, and then press fit them into the extra slot that you routed in the back. In my case, I want it centered on this wall. So measure how wide the wall is and then mark a line down the center. Then, using a stud finder, find the nearest stud to that center line and mark that as well. You definitely want this in a stud. It is reasonably heavy, and even if it wasn't, if you drop this and smashed it, that thought just stresses me out. Don't do that. On the back of your mounting board, mark out a center line. Then measure how far over your stud is from that. Mark out a line there as well. And then drill some holes through from back to front. Since you're going to be using some decently long screws, you want to make sure that the bit is a little bit wider than the screw itself, and that'll make sure that the screw doesn't bind with it. Alright, it's almost time to hang this, so go and attach all your brackets to the front. Do a quick test fit of the Falcon before you put this up on the wall. If these don't line up just right, it's going to be quite a pain if you're holding this thing up in the air. Take some long screws and drive them through your mounting board right into the stud. Definitely make sure that this is on there really well. I ended up hanging off of mine just to make sure that it could hold my weight. The Falcon was never meant to be hung up like this. Because of that, a lot of the plates just sort of sit on top and use gravity to hold them in place. When you hang them on the wall, gravity is going to pull them off. I made some minor modifications to a couple of these plates just to make sure that they stayed on and stayed together. This is not the only way you can do this. This was an attempt to use as few pieces as possible and to modify the set as little as I could. So feel free to use this as a guide, but change it however you see fit. This piece has an extra plate that you need to add once it's back on the Falcon. This is roughly where it will go once it's in place, but it's really hard to show you while it's actually on the Falcon. You'll have to attach it, then reach under and actually clip it in place once this whole plate is back on. Before you hang the Falcon, take some decent wire and put it through that hole that we drilled in the center piece. You can do this for the other brackets as well, but for me that was overkill, so I didn't bother. You can pick up the Falcon by taking off the top center circle and reaching in and grabbing the main structure. It's not a particularly light set, but you should be able to do it with one hand. Take the Falcon up to the mount and feed the wires through the Falcon so they're around those two main pieces that the top mount point is actually going to be attaching to. Once you have those through, take the Falcon and slide it onto the mounting points, then take that wire and twist it around and pull it tight so that it basically ties the Falcon to the mount point.